We thank you for joining us to celebrate this special film screening at the UN of Harmony, a new way of looking at our world. We are grateful and give thanks to our long-standing partners, such as the Permanent Mission of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations, for making this event possible, as well as the support of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. We are very honored to be able to have with us here today Academy Award-nominated filmmaker, broadcast journalist, and screenwriter Stuart Sender. Stuart has an extensive career background working on numerous award-winning documentary films and series, such as Prisoner of Paradise, which won the prestigious Grimson Award for Best Documentary, and the weekly PBS series of South Africa Now, which won a Polk Award for an excellence in journalism and a New York Emmy for Best News Magazine. An experienced journalist with strong knowledge of the United Nations via his involvement as a senior producer of the documentary Mandela, Free at Last, and most recently, Stuart directed episodes of Year of Living Dangerously, the acclaimed Showtime documentary television series focusing on climate change and featuring Matt Damon and Michael C. Hall. As producer and director of Harmony, we would like to thank Stuart for letting us to promote this new and inspiring perspective of how the world can meet challenges of climate change globally, locally, and personally. The film presents how, over the past 3 decades, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, has worked side by side with a dynamic array of environmental activists, business leaders, artists, architects, and governments to address the global environmental crisis and find ways toward a more sustainable, spiritual, and harmonious relationship with the planet. Since its premiere at the Sundance Film Festival in 2012, Harmony has been screened in many places, included last September in the Dominican Republic at our GFDD Environmental Film Festival. Our interest in presenting this film is to raise awareness and deepen understanding of the impact of climate change in order to mobilize global action and support for a UN agenda that will tackle this issue as a priority. With this in mind, before I leave you with Stuart, please, Stuart Sender to introduce his film and provide some main remark. Please stay after the screening for a question and answer session on climate change. Please, Stuart, join us here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really kind of you. It's nice to be at the United Nations. I want to thank my colleagues at the Dominican Mission, at the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development, who are incredibly gracious and generous hosts, the United Nations Environment Program, which is also sponsoring today, and it's wonderful to see all of you, my family's here, my parents who are great supporters of my work, and friends and work colleagues, and you know, we've kind of been developing a special relationship with our friends in Santo Domingo, which really has an important stake in this conversation around climate. Santo Domingo has actually just made a World Bank list of 5 cities which stand to be the most impacted by climate change between now and 2050. And what we see, and part of what we'll see in our film, Harmony, is that some of the people who did the least to make this mess are going to be impacted by it the hardest and first. And this collaboration that we've had with Prince Charles, who's been, and you'll learn a little bit about this in the film, has been a long-time organic farmer who's been on the front lines of this conversation around climate change, who you'll learn made his own film about global warming in 1990, and 20 years later, when I was introduced to him, was asking, you know, what's happening? Because in 1990, when we first started to talk about this, we didn't realize the mess we were making. But now, 20 years later, we do. And here we are, you know, supposedly an intelligent civilization, destroying our oceans, our atmospheres, our forests. Like, what's up with that? So this was the question about harmony, that we sort of were tackling, making this movie Harmony. As Yasmina said, the film's had a kind of interesting trajectory. It started as a television special that aired on NBC a couple of years ago, and then we made this feature version, which has been shown at the first Sundance Festival in London, at film festivals around the world. It's being distributed by Discovery International, and we're really, really pleased to be at the United Nations to show the film to you. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to talking to you after you watch Harmony, a new way of looking at our world inspired by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. Thanks.
I could only somehow imagine that I found myself being born into this position for a purpose. But I started 22 years ago as something that nobody really wanted to know about, except a few people who thought it was pretty crazy. This is an historic moment. Just as mankind had the power to push the world to the brink, so too do we have the power to bring it back into balance. The way nature presents herself, we've turned it into just merely a mechanical process. We've managed to describe it very cleverly, we've analyzed it. We can also create brilliant technologies which have been extremely valuable and helpful. But at the same time, we seem to have lost that understanding of the whole of nature and the universe as a living entity. It is easy to focus solely on the challenges, the worst-case scenarios, the what-ifs of failure. But take a moment to consider the opportunities if we succeed. Imagine a healthier, safer, and more sustainable, economically robust world. Remember that our children and grandchildren will ask not what our generation said, but what it did. So let us give an answer of which we can be proud.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are many issues discussed in this film, to deal with deforestation, to deal with sustainable farming, to deal with the issue of climate change overall. So first of all, I just personally, as an English person, I wanted to know how you came to be in contact with Prince Charles, because that doesn't happen to many of us in the UK, and how you managed to get involved with him and embark on that journey.
Well, thanks again, Mark. Thank you all for being here and watching the movie. I actually got a phone call from a colleague who worked in the organic food industry. He ran a place in Boulder, Colorado called the Organic Center. And because Prince Charles has been a longtime organic farmer, and he has a company called Dutchy Originals where they sell organic and natural products. And the proceeds go to charities. And they were talking about bringing this company to the United States. And some of these products are sold in Whole Foods and some other places. And he met the prince, and a conversation started about a movie. And he said, well, I know the filmmakers. You might want to talk to these people in Los Angeles. And so he called me and he said, would you like to meet the Prince of Wales? And I said, yeah, I guess. And I confess I didn't know a lot about the Prince's work, and he gave me a book called The Radical Prince. And it was this astonishing book about all the work that Prince Charles had done over years, his speeches about farming and nature and war and peace and sustainability. I was really kind of knocked out by it. So a phone call was arranged with the Prince's people in London, and I swear to God, one morning it was like 6:30 our time in Los Angeles, and the phone rang, and there was a voice on the other end that said, Buckingham Palace calling. And I thought I was still dreaming, or I was in a Monty Python sketch. But a really kind of extraordinary conversation started, And when I finally had a chance to meet the prince, I was really knocked out. I was really surprised. I was really impressed with how smart, thoughtful, deeply immersed in these issues he is. And over the course of a couple of years, he was really very deeply involved in this film. You know, I went to school with him because he'd thought about things, about the connections between how we grow our food and how we build our cities, and these kind of interesting spiritual connections, and how we do business and what large-scale solutions could be. And I found out he was doing things like bringing together the heads of the largest pension funds in the world to say to them, you know, hey, maybe we need to think about looking out past quarterly profits, that we need to really think about how we look at the world in different ways. And so it was really a kind of unexpected collaboration and a great education for me, and hopefully a little bit for other people too.
Definitely. Yeah, I must admit, even as an English person, I was never aware that he'd done so much. I know I always grew up with him, you know, being involved in quite a few things, but the extent to which his foundations have, you know, put forward that cause and that transition.
I think too, a lot of people for a long time, as he said, you know, they really didn't get it. Like, why is the next king of England interested in the soil,
Yeah, exactly.
right? What do you mean organic food and farming? And people thought he was a little bit out there. And now, you know, he looks much more prescient.
You say you went to school with him, kind of on these issues. What's your take on what harmony is?
Well, what I hope that we were able to do was, one, you know, the tricky thing about covering these stories, and it's also interesting to look at this film because when we started, I think there was a much bigger debate going on about whether climate change was real or not. And there's a very small group of people who've spent an awful lot of money to say that it isn't. But it feels like recently, you know, President Obama's kind of calling out climate deniers and saying, look, you know, if somebody told you had lung cancer, you wouldn't say, well, maybe I don't have lung cancer. You know, you'd treat it. Yesterday, a report was issued by Mayor Bloomberg and two former United States Treasury secretaries, and they started this new website called riskybusiness.org that was really talking about how much money is at stake. You know, never mind human lives, if we don't do something, you know, urgently and seriously about this. So I hope it's both kind of urgent and hopeful, the movie, and I hope that it gets people thinking about ways that some issues and some ideas that might have seemed disconnected are in fact importantly connected, and that with a nod to people in this room who are interested in the internal life as well as the external life, that this is also kind of an inside job, right? It's about who we want to be as people and how do we want to live. And that's kind of, you know, the larger question.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think that there is definitely a very positive note to the film, and the fact that you cover so many different countries as well, so it really gives a global vision of how people are engaged on those issues. And I think the overlap between New Orleans, for example, and the Duchy of Cornwall home farm, and how the Poundbury village are interconnected. So I think that the illustrations are quite good in that sense, that you do come away with a very positive note, and you do identify with a lot of what's going on today and how it's continuing on that journey.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things where I'd really give a lot of credit to the prince. You know, I found myself like in this hut in rural India with this peasant farmer and with a bricklayer, and you know, in the wilds of British Columbia with First Nations people, and you know, at the steel mill in the UK, and you know, and it was trippy at times to think about, I'm here because, you know, the Prince of Wales wants to connect. Like, these are his people. And I think that one of the things that he really understands is that the front line of this is with those people, right? That people who sort of are most in touch with the land, with nature, you know, and at times I think that also can seem like very abstract. And, you know, for some maybe a little, you know, in ways that they thought of him as a little woo-woo kind of, but it's, I think we're getting that more and more that's the truth.
Yeah.
And so that was also, you know, like a big part for me of making, you know, what was always a really interesting connection, and clearly without someone like the Prince to sort of front a project like this, you're not going to get NBC to put it on in prime time, and you know, he really has taken his office and used it for a lot of good.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think at this stage we'll just hand it over to the audience. We should have 2 microphones to circulate around the room. I believe we've got some people that can help do that.
I may be a little biased. My name is Leo Sender, and I'm honored to have Stuart as my son. I watched the picture. I saw the short version a couple of years ago, and I am so impressed with this, since I'm among those people who's probably on his way out rather than on his way in. But how do you get the world to see this film, and how does the UN maybe get behind something like this? Because I look at it, and it's a way for people to get together, and when you read the papers nowadays, and you see the world at peace, how can you also get people to look at this and say, it's not only that we have to be in harmony with nature, we have to be in harmony with one another.
Well, thank you. I think you said it very well, and right back at you. Thanks.
My name is Joanna Retta. Let me say congratulations because a wonderful job. I'm a filmmaker lover. But I would like to know how long it took you making all this project, because I know 1 hour in television is a major work.
Well, like these things, you know, the way these things sort of work is, you know, people get together and there's an idea. So that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And then there's a little time of, is this a good idea? I'll tell you like a little inside story that you'll get a kick out of. So we meet, we decide everybody likes each other, and they ask me to write up a couple of pages about what my ideas are for the film. So I write up a couple pages, and I think they're sort of good, and I send them off. But I've realized as we're working that my spell check on my computer keeps adding an H to the word whales. And I have to keep going through and taking it out because I don't want to call him the Prince of Wales. He's the Prince of Wales. But I missed one. And so I sent over this thing. It almost tanked the entire project. But we decided to try it out, and we worked together, and we really felt that there was a really meaningful collaboration. So that was like 2008. And then it took a little while to sort of get all the business done and start to film. And then we did the first version of the film was actually in 2010. And that aired on NBC as a TV special in prime time, which is kind of crazy for this sort of material and this kind of film, but it was only a television hour. And we felt there was a lot more that we had to say. And then in the middle of that and kind of getting this out about 1.5 years ago, there was like a royal wedding and the Queen's Jubilee, and so these things sort of slowed it down. But interestingly, there's been a lot of, and apropos of your question, Dad, there's been a lot of interest in the movie since, and in some ways troubling, the world sort of caught up a little bit to this story. And so it's been, you know, not a full-time job, but something that's occupied me and my Julie, my producing partner, and Grisha, who was our lead editor, who led a great team of really dedicated people, and so it's occupied us on and off for quite some time. And you know, in a lot of ways, that's what films like this do, as you alluded to in your question. Thanks.
There's a question down here.
Yeah, and there's one there. He's got the mic first, and then you can go next. Hi.
First, I want to congratulate you. It's a great, great, great work. I want to ask you something regarding your experience doing this film. How developing countries can contribute with this effort? Because I know they have priorities, like surviving priorities, and I know like very developed countries can create programs or can be involved in the kind of project to have some kind of reservoirs. But how come developing countries be involved in this kind of initiative? Thank
First,
you.
maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and
Oh, sorry.
tell us where
I'm
you're from.
Napoleon Beres from the Permanent Mission Dominican Republic to the United Nations. Thank you.
And thank you. I really want to thank the mission, and I had an amazing experience in the Dominican Republic. We showed the film at last year's Dominican Republic Environmental Film Festival, and I look forward to going back this year with the climate change project we just finished, which is a series for Showtime. I think it's a really important question. I mean, the issue of developing countries, again, is that developing countries are the places that are going to get hit first and worst by climate change, right? The United States, creates 25% of the world's greenhouse gases, and it took, I think in a lot of ways, it took Superstorm Sandy, right, to kind of shake us. So the hope is, we get a storm that's bad enough to shake us into reality, but not so bad that it destroys us, right? For developing countries, this recent report from the World Bank says that the Dominican Republic, which survives in so many ways by tourism and this beautiful country and beautiful beaches, those beaches are really at risk, right? Santo Domingo, this beautiful old city on the coast, is really at risk. We just did a segment about Bangladesh, where already tens of millions of people along the coast are being displaced. Here we saw a little taste of what's happening along the Gulf Coast, and that was a couple of years ago, right, where every hour an area the size of a football field is disappearing into the Gulf of Mexico, and where there were saltwater fishing, deep sea fishing, now in areas where they were grazing cattle. So it seems to me that developing countries have a critical role in kind of getting out in front and talking about what is happening in your country first, figuring out ways to tell those stories. And I know it's difficult because it's up to the big states. It's up to China. It's up to the United States. It's up to India, and I guess in some ways India and China qualify as both, right? And I think the other part of it is, what will we do with our economies? You live in a country that arguably could take a leadership in developing wind and solar power and at a scale that could probably really demonstrate what the possibilities are and possibly shift into some kind of real economic benefits. But these things are tricky, as you said, when people are dealing with their daily survival. And, so I don't know that there's an easy answer, but it does seem to me, especially at the United Nations, that there's a really important message for developing countries to deliver and to continue to deliver to the industrialized world. This is, look, we didn't cause this, and we're the ones who are bearing the brunt, and we really have to figure out how that burden's going to be shared. And hopefully in the next few months, the next sort of major climate conference is in Paris next year, and hopefully something real will come out of that, because it's been too long a time coming, And then I think also, finally, in a serious way, in the U.S., and it's been on the table for a long time in other places, is putting a price on people's use of carbon. and that it's a way for big companies who again are continuing to do things that contribute to climate change, paying for their use of everybody else's natural resources. And I think that that's a really important thing that they need to be called out on. And you at the mission maybe know better about how to talk to other countries, other big institutions than I do. But I think the developing world has a really critical voice in this, because your country and others are the ones that are really going to bear the burden of this soonest.
Adding to that, I think that at the UN level, at least, I know that UNESCO have an initiative called Education for Sustainable Development, and the climate change branch of that initiative have a pilot project, and that pilot project looks to train teachers in countries, specific countries, on climate education, to teach their students about climate change. And the Dominican Republic is one of those 5 pilot projects that's being implemented. I believe so far, from what I've read, that 400 teachers, in the DR have been trained on climate education, and there are plans to increase that. And I just tying into what you were saying about the need to educate people, and I think that the DR is actively engaging with that process, tying it into the UN as well. And finally, at the UN level, in preparation for that summit in 2015, there is a UN climate summit taking place this September that the Secretary General is organizing. And I know that the Sierra Club are organizing a march in New York to put pressure on the US mission and the US government to put forward bold and concrete commitments for climate change. So there really is an opportunity there for civil society, for people to come down into New York and really put pressure on the UN and the member states, heads of state that will be there as part of the General Assembly to take part in the climate summit and really bring something to the table. So that's just to tie back to what you were saying. Thanks. I think there's a question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you first.
Hi, I'm Doris Hilson. I'm an old friend. I would just like to know where you got the funding for all this. It's could cost quite a bit of money.
Yeah, the funding for the film came from a few different sources. It came from some private foundations, came from a couple of individual investors, and then from a partnership with a German production company who are colleagues of mine, and they were able to access some funds from a German government film fund, and then also from NBC, which paid to help the film get made.
There's a question up there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Myrna Coffino. I represent the National Space Society. I also have a background in construction. I was a purchasing agent. I was a building complex manager, and I'm in real estate now, and I have a hobby of anthropology and archaeology. I've taken many field trips all over the world. You touched on man's consciousness of his surroundings in the early beginning, and it made sense to me, the birds, the circles, because I study the rock art and the circles and the meanings of the little things 20,000 years ago that were carved in the mountains, and I'm doing it professionally. And I'd like everybody to know there is a course at the American Museum of Natural History on climate change. There's educational courses. You can do it online as well as take the course physically. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your work.
Thanks. If you could hand the mic behind you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ethan Silverman. I'm a writer and teacher, an old friend of Stuart's. If you don't mind, I'd like to just go back to some of the first questions that came up. I kind of found His Royal Highness Prince Charles a bit of a tragic figure because I think the circumstances of his life made him timid, and he came out with these things in a very strange and odd way. I was going to school in London in the early 80s, and people made fun of him about poetry he wrote, about his love of nature, and then he really seemed like a very young fuddy-duddy when he was upset about the new architecture in London. And now, of course, you know, you see that he wasn't loony, and he, you know, was ahead of his time and kind of a beautiful person. But I think he's tragic in that he was never really allowed, because of his role, to be political. And the royal family is not allowed to take sides politically. So he's in a very strange position, I find. And okay, I'll get to the point. He wants to be an activist. He wants to do something. He is doing a lot. He is really down in the dirt, no pun intended. But at the same time, the royal family has been incredibly out of touch. The closing of the steel mills was one of the worst things that happened to the working class in the UK, and the divide has been strong there for a long time. I don't need to give a history lesson, but did you sense when you were with him that he was a frustrated man personally, because he has gotten so much bad press, especially at home, especially with what happened with his former wife? And I felt, always kind of been misunderstood, and I think you're doing the guy a great service, and I would like to see him out there more. Also, the great tragedy that he's not been allowed to assume the throne, and he may never now. But did you sense, would you be willing to say that you sensed any sense of frustration from him?
Look, I mean, I think all are like interesting points for conversation, but I think the really crucial thing for me was we started this film, and it was always going to be not a film about the prince, but a film sort of about the principles, right? And I don't get the sense that he's frustrated around his role. I think he's frustrated about what's happening in the world and passionate about what's happening in the world. And the truth is, he's been doing a lot for a long time. You know, I didn't get into sort of the politics of behind the creation of that town, Poundbury, but it was really interesting because he went to his people and said, I want to create this model town in the Duchy of Cornwall, which is this area that's sort of under the jurisdiction of the Prince of Wales. And they said, well, this doesn't make any sense. And he insisted on it, right? He decides to become an organic farmer, you know, in 1980. And they're like, what is an organic farmer? Why are you the head of the Soil Association? You know, there was a wonderful speech he gave on his 40th birthday where he joked precisely about people thinking he was going to show up at his birthday party in saffron robes and try and levitate. You know, so I think he's always been very self-aware and aware of people's opinions of him. And I had this idea too about his stance on architecture, that he was kind of a reactionary around architecture. But now that I really understand what he's been trying to say about indigenous architecture, about people's quality of life, you know, I get that he's had really strong beliefs that he's been willing to kind of, you know, take a hit for. And, you know, you're right about the steel mills. And who was going out to the steel mills to talk to the steel workers and try and negotiate something? It was the Prince of Wales. And that was fascinating to me. So I think that he's very conscious and of his role. And yes, there are limitations to the role. And he's crossed that line a lot and taken a lot of flack for that too, because there's constitutional sort of guidelines about what the royal family can and can't do, and especially if and when he does ascend to become king. So all that is kind of fascinating sort of grist for the mill. But I think what you see in the movie, and there's a lot of stuff about him personally and what he's done, including, you know, a foundation for corporate social responsibility that he set up over 30 years ago to train CEOs and corporate executives and what their roles and responsibilities are. There's a lot of stuff that he's done, you know, in order to use his role I think, as a convener, too, as much as anything, right? You saw those world leaders in his office talking about rainforests. Well, that wasn't going to happen unless somebody with his standing, and in a lot of ways only he has that standing because he's got real credibility on these issues, and people will show up and, you know, brought all those people together. So I think that he's found, you know, really interesting and productive ways to utilize his, you know, admittedly unique and sometimes challenging role.
Any other questions? Going forward, I have a question myself. I wanted to know, because we talked about your most recent project, the Years of Living Dangerously series. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about your involvement in that project and how you see it in sort of relation to your project of Harmony, and how that maybe that continues on your journey dealing with the issue of climate change.
Well, I think one of the things about this story is it's challenging to figure out how to tell it in ways that people want to hear it. How do you tell the story of an impending disaster and not, you know, leave people on the floor feeling kind of hopeless, but at the same time we have to tell the truth. As a filmmaker and as a journalist, I think that the sort of the enterprise of news and journalism bears a lot of responsibility for both advancing the story and falling down on it. So, as the prince says at the beginning of this film, you know, 20 years ago he made a movie, and now we're still doing things to destroy our home. Why are we doing them? The Years of Living Dangerously series was started by colleagues who were former producers for 60 Minutes, who were distressed about the fact that there was like no coverage on the network news of climate change. And if you look at the trajectory from 2009 until 2012, it was diminishing every year. There was something, I don't know, 1,300 minutes on the 3 main network newscasts of climate change coverage in 2009, and by 2012 there was 350 minutes. And here's the biggest story of our time. So these guys went and got James Cameron, the director, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and a very well-known director in Hollywood, Jerry Weintraub, to executive produce a series called Years of Living Dangerously, and recruited some really interesting celebrity correspondents who would kind of report these stories. And the results are really beautifully shot, really informative and in a lot of ways entertaining series about climate change that just finished its first run on Showtime, called Years of Living Dangerously. I was brought in to produce and direct an episode that featured Matt Damon and Michael C. Hall, who's the actor from Dexter, and we worked on an episode about rising temperatures and heat waves that was centered in Los Angeles primarily. And after all the work I'd done, there I was in my hometown, looking at research that had been done by a climate scientist at UCLA about the increase in average temperature in Los Angeles County, that it's going up 5 degrees by the year 2040. And it's already pretty hot in LA a lot. And then another 5 degrees by the end of the century if we don't do something about it. And now we're in like a whole other climate zone. And then we brought in researchers from the Environmental Protection Agency in California and a scientist from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta who works at their climate change desk. And I didn't know the Centers for Disease Control had a climate change desk, but extreme weather is a really serious issue in terms of human health and well-being, and it's a little bit of a mess. With all apologies to my 16-year-old daughter, because it ain't going to be pretty. And there was something really impactful about seeing what was going to happen in the neighborhood I live in, even for me, kind of immersed in this work. So And I'm working on actually developing a course to teach, a university course that we're going to teach with a colleague at the Annenberg School in next year about covering climate change, because I think there's a really important conversation about how do we, continue to talk about these stories, how do we tell people what's happening, how do we get people engaged in these stories, how do we look at solutions, and now we're into a whole other thing, which is this word mitigation, because this is happening, so how do we mitigate the changes, right? I mean, flooding of Battery Park in downtown New York, and people in the tri-state area without electricity and hot water for weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, that was the stuff of a science fiction movie until late last year. So this is happening, and now we're going to have to think about, what we're really going to do about it. And the tipping point of too late is soon, but it's not. So I think, I think I'm in this work now for a little while.
I think we all look forward to seeing more of your work in that field as well.
Thank you all for being here. I really want to thank you again, and the Dominican Mission and the Global Foundation and the Film Festival, and you, Mark, and Emmy, and Yasmin. Thank you for hosting me, and it's lovely to see friends and family and colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.